Hello there, everyone. Fabulous to have you all here today. Interesting topic, this one, prioritising. I want to drill down into that today. So I guess today is an examination, a stepping deeply into this notion of what it means to prioritise. So to some point, while I am doing a coronavirus update, Shutdown Brunch Professional Learning Day, I certainly want to acknowledge that what I'm also doing is stepping away a little bit from coronavirus today and talking more deeply about this notion of prioritising, because I don't think that it's just now that we need to have the skill of being able to prioritise or being able to work out what's important. I want to start with what I would call a contentious position, and that is that in education, in schools, we potentially, I think, do prioritising worse than almost any other industry. And I think it's because we've come to view that in education, everything's important. And I want to, I guess, preface today by saying that today the view that I take is that anti-importance is the angle we need to take. In fact, when it comes to being able to determine what's a priority, importance is the wrong thing to think about. And so what I want to do today is to lead you on what it means to genuinely triage responsibility, to genuinely be able to work out what you need to focus on first. And mostly what I want to do is to emphasize upon you today a really important notion, and that is that whatever you choose to work on, that it should be of high return on investment. Sometimes what happens when we seek about the notion of prioritizing is that we start to do things that we might believe are important, and they may be, but we have a low return on investment of the things that we do. We try to make things better when the truth is we need to do things differently. And so it's a bit of a mind frame that we're going to work through today that I hope will be useful to you across this unique state-by-state coronavirus interruption that we're a part of at the moment. But I hope that it's something that's going to be useful for you down the track as well. In fact, I know that it's certainly been really useful for me. So what I would love you to do today is to make sure that you're a part of the webinar today. So a couple of ways you can do that. Number one is that you can use the chat function. So using the chat function means that you're able to step in and just type something in there. I want to remind you that the default setting with Zoom seems to be that that you send a message to panelists, and I just want you to make sure that you check that when you do send a message that you're not just sending it to Simon and I, who are on board today for you, that you're actually sending it to everyone. So just check that setting and make sure that you're able to send a message to absolutely everyone. And the other way that you can get involved is I can look at my attendee list here and I can see Francesca and Melissa and Robin and I can get you involved as well if you've got something that you'd like to ask. I can press a button on my end called Allow to Talk, and I can unmute you and we can hear from you, which would be fantastic as well. But I'm wondering if you could just first up, if you wouldn't mind, just give me a couple of words in the chat room there about how does it feel to be a school leader to you right now. What words would you use? You can put more than one word, but if you had to try and summarize it down to maybe 1, 2 or 3 words, what words would you use to describe what it feels like to be a school leader right now in the middle of this situation? Can I get a couple of words from you and I'll give you a moment to think about what they are? Exhausting. Yeah, that makes sense, Robin. And I'm going to actually elaborate on that a little further as we go. I'll give you a couple more moments because I know we've got some other people here today. What are the words that describe the way it feels at the moment to be a school leader? Stressful. Yeah, that makes sense too. All right. And I guess for me, the other words that I've heard from people lately are things like, oh, there it is, Melissa, you beat me to it, overwhelm. This feeling that there are so many things I could do that, one, I feel the weight and the responsibility of all of them. So there's a cumulative effect about all the things that I can or should do. And then I guess one of the things that I think has contributed to what Melissa's saying there around overwhelm is that there's now a whole bunch of new responsibilities that we have. So what I would like to do today is to try and help you to be able to build the skill of which ones you need to tackle first, because you began the school year with a list of things that you needed to do, a list of responsibilities. We've now had a whole heap of new ones added to them, including, crazy things like try and reimagine the whole educative experience for your school using without students being present in your school. And it can. I think those feelings of exhaust and stress and overwhelm are genuine, and they're real. Of course, I can't do much about it in your school, but what I can do is to help you to be able to prioritise a little bit, to be able to work out which ones you can work on, you need to work on first. That's really good to know. A little word about results before we get going today. So a word about results when it comes to working both in your school and in terms of this webinar today. I think that there are 4 ways that this could all go for us and it could go for your school. Both, like I said, in the short period of time that we have in our webinar today, but also in our schools over the coming weeks and months. First thing that could happen, I think, is that things get a little worse. To be really honest, I don't think they'll get a lot worse. So I don't think that when I've watched what teachers have done over the last few weeks, they're not breaking education. They're doing an amazing job. And I think that one of the things that will be interesting to watch is what happens when all of that work has been done and when our students return. And I think it'd be really interesting to have a look at what is it that's left behind. What is it that we say, no, we're taking that because we discovered that in this period and we're going to keep that. Because I think mostly there's going to be a bit of a snap back to the old model when all of our students do come back on. The things that make things a little worse are often our agendas. So we come to a session today, for instance, you might have already decided what it is that's important about what you want to work on and what you want to prioritise. And I want to encourage you to suspend that notion of whatever it is you want to work on today, because they become scripts and patterns and habits that drive the way that we work. And all we do when we try to learn about prioritising is kind of add to them. We make it harder for ourselves to move forward. And in fact, things do sometimes get a little worse. Sometimes they stay the same. And the thing that drives that is your notion of being involved in a webinar like today, but then turning the webinar off and going back to your task list. So actually just knowing that everything stays the same. I had a really interesting experience when Adam hung out with me and talked about priorities for 40 minutes or so. But what happened is that I got back to work straight away after it and I didn't change much. Our habits are incredibly strong. I'm often talking to a fellow called James Clear at the moment. Well, I don't talk to him, I talk about him. So I read his book, Atomic Habits, and we sent it out to a bunch of school leaders around Australia that we work with in partnership. And what I find amazing about Clear's work was probably one quote that really got under my skin. And he said, we never rise to the level of our ambitions. We fall to the level of our systems. So what he's saying is that our habits of working are so ridiculously strong that even in a webinar like today, if you decide, right, that's it, I'm doing something completely different, it's unlikely to happen. It's unlikely to happen. So what we want to do is to get out of things staying the same, and perhaps we can make things a little bit better. And what happens there is you kind of get into process. So you start to actually make decisions and you start to think a little more deeply, and you get in the flow of a session like this. You might even get in the flow of a change process in your school. Yet you're still distractible to comparison and outcomes. And what I mean by that is that we get really distracted by what other schools are doing. I think that one of the key examples that I've ever seen around this has been something that's pervaded education or the schools conversation, particularly online in social media over the last couple of years, has been pages that have been set up on platforms like Facebook for teachers to get together and they share ideas. And the truth of what they're trying to do in sharing those ideas, and this is a bit of an unfortunate element of human psychology here. The truth is that what they're doing is they're comparing ideas. They're not so much sharing them. They're trying to come up with a better idea than the one that was previous to that. The examples that I've seen around that come from a really simple concept, which is that the very best teachers And this is something that came out of a study that was done several years ago now, where what they did was they looked at the best action that they looked at across several states in the United States, the schools who were kind of punching above their weight a little bit, who were kind of recording better results than they should have been. And they went to those schools and they asked the students there who are the very best 5% of schools, and said, who are the best 5% of teachers? And they had them identify those teachers. And then they asked those teachers, they asked those kids again, the second layer of the surveying was, what do those teachers do? They kept it really simple. What do they do? And the thing that came out as number one was they say good morning and they use my name, which is just extraordinary, isn't it? You know, it's such a simple, it's not pedagogical, it's not scientific, it's not difficult, it doesn't take a lot of time. But the very best students in the very best schools say that the very best teachers do that. So it's really simple and it's really short. Yet, when you go back to those Facebook groups and look at how that's being exploited and how that's being shared, it's being shared through actions that make it harder to do that. I don't know if any of you have seen they're beautiful stories, but the stories of teachers standing outside classrooms with individualised handshakes that take 15 to 30 seconds for every single student as they come into the classroom. It makes a fantastic clip on Facebook, but that's a lot of effort to go to, considering the kids really just want you to say good morning and use their name. You know, so there's I think that's a lot of effort and a lot of showing off that happens. And what happens is we're inviting comparison. Now, for me, I lean on, again, a really clever person I know, a friend of mine called Matt Church. And Matt's a motivational speaker and looks a lot into what makes people motivated. And thereby, he looks into what makes people unmotivated too. And he says there are two keys to misery in this world. One is unreasonable expectations. So to have the expectation that all of your teachers are going to go to some sort of crazy effort to do individualised handshakes, particularly in a secondary school, good luck with that. And then secondly, it's comparison. Comparison, in fact, what we do when we personally look at other people and say, what's that person like, is we invite shame into our lives. And it rarely allows us to make cataclysmic and enormous change. So what I would like you to do is to not just make things a little bit better by just getting a couple of little things going that really might just lead to comparison and outcomes. What I would like you to do is get to the point where things get a lot better. And I think that what happens there is we get into the land of thinking about beliefs. And as leaders, what happens is we start to get into the notion of cultivating beliefs. Now, beliefs, man, this is such an interesting topic to get into. Beliefs are really interesting. And I've come to the belief about beliefs that the best beliefs aren't necessarily true. So beliefs by definition can be defined as aspirational thoughts that we collectively hold to be true, but they don't have to be true. In fact, what we need the best beliefs to do is to be useful. So I'm often breaking this down for people and saying that what I think we need to do as leaders is to get ourselves to the point where we're the leaders of useful beliefs. So examples would be, if I were to ask everyone in a room, and I often do this when I'm working with an entire staff of educators, I'll ask them, who here thinks that the AFL Premiership, if it gets run this year, the AFL football, who thinks it will be won by Richmond, Collingwood or West Coast? And they're three of the best teams, so people tend to, quite a few people will put their hand up. And then I'll get a second group. I go, who thinks it should be it'll be one of the other 15 teams? And so a few more hands will go up. And then I go, who couldn't care less? And a whole bunch of hands will go up. So we've got three groups in the room, which means that by definition, 2/3 of the room is probably wrong. So we can believe things and that's fine, but it's not necessarily true. I'll then go a little deeper and I'll ask a room about their spiritual beliefs. So I'll ask, particularly if I'm working in a government school, the divide happens a little less so in a faith-based school. But with a government school, if I ask everyone in the room, who in the room believes in a higher power, who believes that there's some sort of celestial being that helps them to be able to lead a good and righteous life through their teachings and learnings. And I reckon it's roughly half the room will put their hand up. And I'll say, and who also then doesn't have that kind of spiritual element to their life, and who believes that being free of religious dogma and teachings actually helps them to be able to lead a righteous life. And about half the room put their hand up. And I point out, and to be really honest, this belief in God thing, half of you are wrong. And there's often some really awkward looks around the room, but I then want to make sure that I'm clear to everyone that the truth about that is that I don't mind, because I don't need you to be right in your beliefs. I just need it to be useful to you. So I think that as leaders, what we need to do sometimes is acknowledge that the truth about beliefs is that they don't need to be true. And as leaders, if we can get ourselves to the point where we're leaders of things that are useful, of beliefs that are useful, like we are a fantastic school, or we put students first, or we believe in first contact in our school, then what happens is that belief becomes useful. And I'm big on us being leaders of beliefs that are useful. To do that means that we can sometimes get ourselves in a position where people in your school, the people you lead, will discover that there's some beliefs that they're holding and carrying that aren't useful. They might be true. So for instance, that kid is a complete pain in the neck. Could be true. Could be true. It's just not useful. That staff member will never change her ways. Well, could be true. Not useful. So what we need to do is to start to be the leaders of new and aspirational beliefs that we can collectively hold to be true, but know that they might not be. But boy, they're useful. And that's, I think, a really important frame. The other frame, as I mentioned, that I want to carry into this notion of prioritising today is how often we fall for the importance trap. I'm wondering how many people have ever described their leadership as being, and when I've got people describing it as being exhausting, stressful and overwhelming, it's probably likely that at some stage you've used this analogy of that leadership is like plate spinning. It's like there's so many things that I've got up in the air that I've got to sort of run around and try to make sure that none of them fall. The act of prioritising is a flip on that, and it's actually saying that, you know what the truth is, we need some plates to fall. You can't add more plates and expect to get better at plate spinning, because the truth is that when you add more plates, what happens is you need to divide your attention one more plate further. So each of those important priorities in your school is now getting a smaller percentage every time we take on something new. The problem we've got is that all of it looks important. In fact, a lot of us, our desks or indeed our steering wheels will look like this. There's, I don't know who else uses Postit Notes. I'm looking around my desk at the moment, and I think at first glance, there's something like 20. I think there's roughly 20 Postit Notes here. Now, some of them are things I've already done. Some of them things I need to get to. Some of them just shouldn't be Postit Notes. But there's so many things here that when I look at it, I just think, oh my goodness, I don't even know where to start. And our lives start to become this unguided piece of work where what we do is we do the thing that can give us a little reward, can give us a little hit. And I don't know about you, I'm a list writer as well. I write lists often because I often write lists that have already got things on them that I've already done, just so I can get the satisfaction of ticking them off. So my psychology around progress is very, very well tuned. There's a fantastic piece of work done by a fellow called Bjorn Lomborg. Now, Lomborg's a really controversial writer, and what I'm going to do now is just paste for you a link into the chat box of his TED Talk. Lomborg's a fascination to me because a lot of the things, there tends to be three things happen when I read something by Bjorn Lomborg. Number one is that he's quite a conservative, or even maybe leaning towards the right wing kind of writer, which, because of my personal preferences, I often read what Lomborg's got to say and I don't like it. I get really annoyed with it. But I then sometimes realise that the second phenomenon is possible, is because I'm annoyed with it because he's right. And then there are times that I watch something and I go, that is exactly the angle that I needed to view this problem from. This happened to me when I watched Bjorn Lomborg's TED Talk on prioritising. And what he did was emphasise the fact that he leads a scientific community that began with what was called the Copenhagen Consensus. And what they did at the Copenhagen Consensus was they brought together initially, and this is going back about 20 years ago or so now, they brought together the 100 most capable and recognised scientists in the world from a variety of different fields. And they said to them that we have 10 big problems in the world. and these are the problems. And they brought to them a hypothetical situation. And they said, if we were to give you $50 billion, and we're not, but they said, if we were to give you $50 billion, can you tell us of these big problems what you would tackle first? Which one do you think is the most important? And I'm wondering if you can guess what happens in that situation. Is that we immediately, and this is what happened when I'm working this with a room, I'll often let them have this debate. I'll say, which one would you work on first? Which one do you think is the most important? And the truth is we can't get consensus. They're called the Copenhagen consensus, and they couldn't get consensus. I've never seen yet a room full of teachers, a room full of school leaders, be able to establish consensus about where we should start on this. I'm wondering if you can imagine which one gets chosen if I were to present this to a room full of educators and say which problem should we tackle first, which is the most chosen topic. Of course, it's education, because we all have a pre-existing bias that we bring to this situation. And so when we look at the list of 10 things, what the human nature is to say, well, I think this one, now I'm going to try and find just cause for why that should be tackled. You can probably imagine the climatologists who were in the room for the Copenhagen consensus the first time, what they fought for. And it was what I would have suggested out of that list too. I'm a big believer that we need to do something urgent around climate change. People who would be doing that activity today may say, no, I don't think so. I think it's communicable diseases is what we need to work on first. And basically what happened is 100 scientists spent most of the first few days of the Copenhagen consensus trying to fight for their own patch, trying to justify a pre-existing bias, trying to convince each other that what they chose was important, and they got nowhere. When they realised they needed a different frame for being able to make this decision was when progress started to be made. And they, instead of fighting for what they believed was important, they said, what could return us the greatest return on the resource we have, which in this case was a hypothetical $50 billion. What would get us a good return on the investment of our time and, in this instance, our effort? And so what they did was think about it a little differently. And they came up with 4 key actions. Now, a couple of these actions got done, and some of these actions didn't get done. But if you think about what's popped out of that thinking about it differently, instead of fighting it, a couple of the actions did get done and didn't work. A couple of these actions did get done and did work, and then some of them weren't able to be done. So if you think a little bit here about what might have been tackled, what came in at number 4 out of the Copenhagen consensus was was attacking malaria. So they did start with communicable diseases. And what they found was that by just instituting nets and medicines in the areas that were most affected by malaria around the world and investing an investment of $1.6 billion in that the economic return on that investment was something like 5 times the investment that they made, which effectively reduced the problem of malaria around the world by half. That's pretty cool. $1.6 billion in terms of the entire world, that's not a massive investment. But they got a fantastic return on it by saying what could get done with the resources that we've got. Instead of fighting for what's important, what could we get done if we drill down into something and say, well, that's kind of a no-brainer. What came in at number 3, this is really fascinating. This one didn't get done. Human psychology and the politics of democracy have prevented us from getting this done. But it was around free trade. And so what they discovered was that when it comes to free trade, if they actually established a genuine free trade policy that ran across the world, it would cost something like $2.4 trillion. But if we were able to change the mindset that in developed countries that they should share some of their resources in a really free way with poor countries, that rich and poor countries would benefit enormously. There were several attempts to model this, what would happen, and every one of them came out positively, that the world would be a better place and we would tackle poverty around the world if we could do that. We just can't get one country to jump first. That's the biggest challenge we've got there. What came in at number 2 as the really interesting effects of the Copenhagen consensus was that they looked at malnutrition. And what they said was the way they've been doing addressing malnutrition produced an enormous amount of waste. So it was individual child sponsorship, which feels good to the person doing it, but doesn't have an enormously high return on investment in terms of improving world poverty. They were doing food drops, which unfortunately often resulted in enormous social issues on the ground, where helicopters and planes would be dropping big sacks of wheat on the ground and just leaving the people on the ground to kind of survival of the fittest fight for it, and it produced a fair bit of waste. But they said the things that kill people first when you become malnourished are an absence of iron, zinc, iodine, and vitamin A. Now, I was even speaking recently to a health professional who's does a fantastic job of helping people in executive positions, I guess, like mine, to stay healthy. And she said, when it comes to coronavirus, if anyone's asking about how what they need to do to stay well, she said, particularly in older people, she said what goes first, what sort of people become who are older become naturally depleted in, is zinc and vitamin A. And so she said, tell the older people in your life to take zinc and vitamin A, because it gives their immune system just a little boost at this time. Because it tends to be not malnutrition that kills you, it's the diseases associated with being depleted in iron, zinc, iodine, and vitamin A that matters most. So they invested heavily as a result of the Copenhagen Consensus to the point of $12 billion, and made a significant improvement, particularly in Africa. And then the last one that came out of the Copenhagen Consensus that I find fascinating is one that I bet none of you can imagine. There was something they tackled, and the reason you can't imagine it is because they fixed it. For all intents and purposes, the notion of HIV/AIDS was addressed through the Copenhagen Consensus. What they found was that an investment of $27 billion, which they were able to muster around the world, if they were able to invest in that, was able to prevent something like 27 million cases of AIDS in Africa alone. So they said, instead of tackling all the communicable diseases and making little plates out of those, they said the one that we could actually get a massive cost benefit on would be if we invested in AIDS. And they found that they actually achieved a 10 times cost benefit to those countries in Africa by keeping all of those people on the planet, with an investment, like I said, of $27 billion, which was basically spent on condoms, advertising campaigns, and research. So fascinating what can be done when you take the notion of, instead of fighting for what's important, that we actually say, what could we get a return on? So your question is not to determine from these problems that exist in schools right now. So the new stuff that's kind of been added to your list, I think if we went through these are probably things that your school is grappling with at the moment. So can I ask you first up, would you mind in the chat box just telling me which one jumps off the page as the most important? Which one do you say, yep, that's the new one that's the most important? So we'll use the old mindset first, and then say, what's important? What do you reckon? What's the most important thing for schools to tackle in the new COVID-19 affected landscape? I'll give you just a moment to have a little think about that. There's a bit to take in. Wellbeing and mental health. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah. Give people just a moment. I'll take my chance to get a drink at this point. I might be a little shy today. It's a pretty, it can be almost even an ethereal sort of concept, this one. Okay, I'll ignore the awkward silence and move on today. Wellbeing and mental health from Robin Dew. Thank you, Robin. So people do tend to be drawn, I think, as educators. Your purpose is often around helping young people to be the best kind of young people they can. So the thing that you see that's in the way of that is their mental health and wellbeing. So people want to go to that point. What I'm saying to you is just reserve that for a moment, and then wonder, with all of the opportunities that stand in front of you now, what would be the small thing that you could do that would have the highest return on investment? Suspend this whole notion, if you will, of wellbeing and mental health. Suspend it, okay? And consider that all of the other 9 opportunities could be argued by someone else as being just as important. And then say, what could I do in my school with the resource that I've got? Now, the resource for most of you that you have in your school is your time. So what could you do that would get that done? Now, for me, I think that what you could do is to consider a really simple template for that. So this is a template that I've been using with schools for some time now. And just to be able to take that high return on investment approach and make it behavioural. So sure, we're going to start with our big theme. So for our school, you're allowed to start with what's important there. So you may say, in our school, I've made the decision that we could make the most ground with wellbeing and mental health. You may say, I'm going to do it in terms of learning trajectories or a viable online learning module. But you're going to say, I've got a hunch that if we tackle that, we'll get a high return on investment. And then what you do once you've done that is you look at our current state. So you go from big theme down to current state. And you just draw a picture. You paint the 4 or 5 key points that describe where are we at. So if you were going to tackle wellbeing and mental health, how would you describe your school currently? How are the kids feeling? How do you see them coping? What about the staff? How do you see them coping? What about the parents? How do you see their mental capability at this point? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is resilience being celebrated? Is resilience low on supply? So you're starting to, are people arguing? Are you seeing an increased rate in conflict? So you're just painting a picture. And sometimes we forget when we're painting the picture that what we need to do is to paint the positive things as well. We look to be very problem solving and problem oriented as a result in schools. And so what I want to suggest to you is forget that for a moment and say, what if I were to just be really honest about the goods and the bads and just talk about what I would work on there, what the current situation is. Then what we want to do is to discuss our desired state. Okay, and so I've just realised I've made a mistake here. Desired state's there twice. I want you to imagine in the bottom right box there that says measure of improvement. Hang in there with me on that. Actually, what do I need to do that for? I'm in a webinar. I can fix that. I think. No, I can't. Don't worry about it. Oh my God, now I've blown the whole thing up. From your current state, I want you to then say, what's your POP? So your POP is your problem of practice. What's the part of the current state? If you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 dot points there that you go, I could work on that. That would have a higher return on investment if we address that. So it could just be uninformed. You might say our parents are complaining that they're uninformed. You might say, right, I'm going to work on my POP is going to be communication with parents. So that's the part of our big theme that we're going to work on. When it comes to identifying your POP, then you can drop down to your desired state, which means say right now, in terms of communication with parents, where would we like to get to? Where would we like to get to? So parents are saying that they're well informed, that the information they get relieves anxiety, that the information they get shows up when they most need it, it's timely, that it shows up on the channels where they are. We want them to start to feel that the desired state is that parents are working and engaging with the school in that way. And then what we might say is, what's our high return on investment strategy? Now, I said to you before, what are you going to invest? You're going to invest your time. So what's going to be the smallest thing that you could do with the highest possible return on investment that would allow you to start to track towards your desired state? I think that one of the things that I've seen, if I were to continue with this example around parent communication, I've seen some exemplary examples of wonderful parent communication happening through, there hasn't been a lot of positive use of social media over the last few years, but boy, has there been some positive use from schools of social media in the last few weeks. If you are looking for an example, may I suggest you go to Durack Primary School's Facebook page. And what I think Durack Primary School have done exquisitely, I'll keep pressing that button, sorry, is send ridiculously positive messages out into the community about what the teachers are focusing on right now. It is so commendable. I am in awe of the clever, intelligent, and thoroughly ridiculous messages that are being sent out to the Durack school community. It's just extraordinary work. So I really want to encourage you to do that. What's their investment on that? It's about 2 3-minute videos a day. from people who are already in the NT. They're on staff, so they're getting teachers to do ridiculous. I saw one the other day where one of their early childhood teachers actually brought her class into the classroom. She's got no students. None of the kids have shown up anymore. So she got the rest of the staff to pretend they were her class. And the principal was being the naughty kid in the class. It was just brilliant. The video went for about 3 minutes, and the engagement in that session and the feedback they were getting was so outrageously positive. So it's costing them about 6 minutes a day. I think you can probably imagine what the return is on that in terms of parents feeling that their teachers are connecting with them, feeling that their teachers are active, feeling that their teachers care. And I think that's fabulous. As I said, bottom right corner there, please ignore the heading that's there. I want you to talk about measure of improvement. So I want you to think a little bit about how you'd know, how you'd have some idea that this is actually working. What are your measures for that? Can you do a survey monkey? Could you get some 3 anecdotal responses? Can you do a couple of little interviews? Can you measure in some way the amount of parent complaints that you're getting at this time and seeing what direction the graph is heading in for your school? Find some way of doing that. One, because you want to know whether it's a good strategy or bad strategy. 2, you want to know if you've actually made your current state better or worse. And 3, the progress behind actually your people seeing that they're getting a high return on the low investment of time that you're asking them to step into is amazingly powerful. So that's kind of how I go about it. So when it comes to prioritizing, this is my template, my strategic template for that. Look at the big thing. And then what I want you to do is drop down one level and describe the current state with that. Then to summarize, is what I'm trying to do here is just to summarize this for you, is to then take one element of that current state and say, that's going to be my problem of practice. Then describe where you would like to get to with that problem of practice by dropping down to desired state. Then we go across with that desired state to look for one high return on investment strategy that would help you move towards that desired state. And then what we want to do in the bottom right box is measure how close we got to getting there. And that's pretty much the gist of it. I'm going to give you a moment there and just because I know I'm giving you a bit of an ethereal topic today, but I wanted to give you something that could be useful now as well as into the future, and just see if we've got, I'm just going to check the chat box and just see if we've got any comments or questions there. And then what I want to do is ask, how are you feeling now? In terms of those Post-it notes, is that overwhelmed? Do you feel like there's an idea that's there for you? Do you feel any additional hope? Have I potentially, Melissa, overwhelmed you even further? Could you tell me how you're going right now about the notion of trying to come up with one strategy that would improve your school, that would take you from current state, which might be exhaust, stress, overwhelm, a little further? How are you feeling now? Shy leaders on today. I'm going to let those answers come up if they do over the next few minutes. A couple of things I want to emphasize to you. Makes sense. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I think it's one of those things we say, yes, we have to prioritize, but we don't stop and think about how very often. How do you work out which is the right plate to spin and which is the right plate to let drop? And so how do you do that? I think that if I was to try and synthesize the webinar today down to a couple of sentences, it would be, you determine which plate needs to stand, that needs attention, because you can get a high return on investment from a small bit of attention. You determine which plate needs to drop because you're pouring a lot of attention into it for little return. It's just not worth it. And I think that's how you can go about thinking about prioritising in your school. Hey, can I encourage all of you today that Simon's been doing a sterling job in the background there of putting links up to what we've got going on in the Real Schools community and world at the moment. He's running a webinar tomorrow morning, Good Friday. We thought about whether we should run one on Good Friday or not. And we went, you know what, every day feels exactly the same at the moment. So this one's for teachers. And it's going to be a little bit, Simon's going to traverse the current circumstance as well as the just provide some broad information for teachers about how to reflect on that old adage that still holds up really well, that the best teachers that we have are firm and fair. It's going to give your teachers a glimpse into the restorative framework then and how that can apply both now and into the future. Really want to encourage you to send the link to that one out to your teachers. The other thing that's happening in the short term is we're running a trivia night tonight. So I know that was Simon's first post in the chat box there. We have almost 200 educators joining us at 7 p.m. tonight, 7:30 p.m. tonight. And so it's not too late. We've had a cracking time building that. So really want to encourage you to grab a drink, grab some food, sit down. We reckon it'll be all over in about an hour and a half or so, and we reckon you'll laugh as much as we have trying to get the thing ready. We just want to be able to put a smile on people's faces tonight. The other thing that I'm doing is school culture hood lifts. If chatting with me about even this notion of what's the priority for your school, even if you would like to work through one of those prioritization templates with me for your school, if you have a look around our socials, there's a link for the school culture hood lifts. It's basically a Calendly link. You just lock in 20 minutes and we have a chat. There's no sell, there's no obligation. It's just if you'd like to chat about what's going on with your school and your role, we can have a yarn. We want to be someone who's perhaps not got that agenda that sometimes your line managers or whoever it may be that's sending information and imperatives your way at the moment. We want to have someone to talk to who doesn't have another agenda to try and get you to implement. We also I've written a book for leaders around school culture, and if you would like a copy of that book, normally it's $19.95. We're giving them away through all of our webinars for anyone who's putting their time aside. So if you would like a copy, all you need to do is to put the word book in the chat box, and we're going to put a book in the mail. Chris will get in touch with you, find out the address that needs to be sent to. If you'd like a copy, please make sure you just put the word book in there and we'll get that to come to you. And then the last thing I wanted to mention to you today is the Real Schools Academy. We begin on May the 4th, I think it is. Amy, who's running the academy, will probably shoot me if I get that date wrong. I think it's May the 4th. We're starting a series of courses, and this isn't a response to coronavirus. We've been working on this now for well over 12 months. A way of taking practice training for people, particularly our teachers who are new to the profession. And some of them have come into the profession in your schools and had to navigate the most bizarre landscape ever. They'll need some help, both now and into the future. So these are a series of 6-week courses in 3 faculties for people who are new to the profession, for people who are establishing in the profession, and for people who are looking to walk towards leadership. So there are 18 different courses that can be run there that are highly connective, highly expert driven, highly around best practice, and very much around deploying a model for your school that means you don't have to pay for relief teachers, you don't have to send people out of the school, you don't have to create disruption, and we think that it's a learning model that people will engage incredibly highly with, and they'll love it. There are some discounts for early birds, and I really want to encourage you to jump onto the Real Schools page, web page, check out the Real Schools Academy. If you would like a prospectus, then just write the word prospectus in the chat box, and we're going to pop that in the mail to you and make sure you get that as well. I think it's something that your teachers will love, and we'll be sending you more information about that as we go. Follow us on the Facey page and just stay in touch, okay, folks? If there's anything we can do to help you, then don't hesitate to reach out. I'm just going to do one last check of the chat box, see if there's anybody that's got a question, or let's go back to my attendee list. I did mess that up before when I was getting the slides slightly wrong there. So I just wanted to check before I go if there's anyone that's got any comments. All right, I'll leave you to it, folks. Thanks so much for coming along. Have a wonderful little Easter break. I know we're trapped at home, but have a really good one, and rest up. And we've got a very, very interesting term 2 ahead of us. Bye for now.